Imagine knowing the day you'll die, the time, the place, the method, it's all set, final. Then, just as you brace yourself, it changes and changes again. Not once, not twice. You lose count. That's how Anne Boleyn, the Queen of England, spent her final 17 days. But this wasn't some tragic accident of court bureaucracy. It was intentional, a weapon. Henry VIII wasn't just executing his wife. He was unmaking her, day by day, delay by delay. And here's the part that chills. She waited for death in the same fortress where she was once celebrated. The Tower of London, where Anne had prepared for her coronation just 3 years before, was now her cage. But death was only the final act. What came before? That was the real performance. The charges were scandalous. Adultery, incest, treason, conspiring to poison the king. They were never meant to be believed. They were meant to humiliate. And while the world watched, Henry rewrote the story of Anne Boleyn, turning England's most powerful woman into its most infamous traitor. Yet what haunts most isn't how she died. It's how calculated it all was. Every choice, her isolation, the imported executioner, the timing, was a line in a script designed to destroy not just a queen, but her legacy. Even the sword that killed her was silent, foreign, and precise. French, like her final moments, didn't even deserve to be English. And when that blade fell, eyewitnesses swore they saw her eyes blink, her lips move. One last prayer, or the body refusing to let go, we'll never know. But what we do know is this: Anne Boleyn's execution was never just about removing a wife. It was about erasing a woman who had become too powerful in a world ruled by men who feared her. She wasn't mourned, she was celebrated, a spectacle, packaged as justice. And it all began the moment she stepped inside the tower. She didn't walk to her death. She waited for it, day after day, wondering when the end would finally come. Let's start there. The walls of the Tower of London were thick, but not thick enough to silence the past. Anne Boleyn, once England's most dazzling queen, now paced the cold stone floor of her chamber. The same tower that had once echoed with cheers on the day of her coronation now swallowed her prayers whole. She had been there for 17 days, not sentenced, not tried, just waiting. But time wasn't a mercy, it was a tool, a weapon. Henry VIII didn't need to torture her with instruments. He used silence and delay. The execution date was whispered, then changed, set, then revoked. Hope dangled, then pulled back. Again. Some nights, Anne begged for sleep. Others, she refused to close her eyes, afraid the next morning would be the morning. And here's the twist. Just 3 years before, she had stood in these same halls draped in gold, crowned Queen of England. She had walked these corridors with pride, her train sweeping marble and eyes watching in awe. Now her footsteps echoed alone. But the true cruelty wasn't in where she was, it was how she was kept. No trial, no defense, just silence, and the deafening anticipation of death. Even the guards around her grew nervous. Not out of pity, but because the delay made them question. Would she be pardoned? Would the king change his mind? No one knew, least of all Anne. She spent hours staring out the narrow slits of the tower's windows, watching the river, watching the skies. Anything but the block. They called it imprisonment. But it was limbo. And then, without warning, the king sent word. A swordsman was en route, not from England, from Calais. The silence broke, but the horror had only just begun. They said it was an act of mercy, that King Henry, in a rare moment of kindness, sent for a French swordsman, renowned, swift, efficient. But mercy doesn't travel hundreds of miles with a blade. Mercy doesn't require theater. The truth? It was choreographed cruelty. Traditional English beheadings used the axe, a brutal tool that often missed on the first blow. But this was precision, a horizontal slash. One stroke, clean, final. Too clean, in fact. Too detached. Anne wouldn't even die by the customs of her own country. Even her execution was outsourced, stripped of national identity, stripped of ceremony, stripped of self. She had never met the man who would kill her. He was a stranger, imported for spectacle, for show. He was paid handsomely not just to kill her, but to make it look effortless. This wasn't mercy, it was branding. A foreign blade gave Henry something the axe could not: control over the image. A sleek end to a messy affair. No hacking, no struggle, just a disappearing act. But Anne wasn't fooled. In her final hours, she seemed almost calm, too calm. Witnesses described her demeanor as cheerful. She even made gallows jokes, said she would soon be remembered as a queen without a head. But psychologists today might call that dissociation, a fractured mind in survival mode. Because deep down, she knew she wasn't being executed. She was being deleted. And the sword was just a symbol of something far more brutal. She wasn't dying for crimes, she was dying for power, for being a woman who rose too far, too fast, too visibly. So when Anne heard the swordsman had arrived, she didn't beg, she didn't plead, she prayed. But even God, it seemed, had gone quiet. The scaffold stood low, barely 3 feet off the ground. Not a mistake, a message. Anne Boleyn wouldn't be granted the dignity of elevation. There would be no final moment looking down upon the crowd as a queen. Instead, she would die eye level, forced to meet the gaze of those who had once cheered her rise, now gathered to watch her fall. Tower Green, normally reserved for nobles, was transformed into a theater of humiliation. No towering platform, no solemn silence. Instead, murmurs of anticipation swelled into a carnival hum. Vendors, onlookers, gossip. The execution wasn't a tragedy, it was entertainment. And still, something darker lurked beneath the surface. The guards were doubled, archers stationed at every entrance, not to protect Anne, to control the crowd. Were they afraid of rescue? A loyalist uprising? A last-minute protest? Or perhaps they feared what the crowd might see too clearly, that this was no justice, this was spectacle. Anne's walk to the scaffold was short, but thick with symbolism. Just steps from the chamber, where she had once dressed for her coronation, she now stepped barefoot toward a platform barely taller than her. Those present didn't bow. They didn't avert their eyes. They watched. Cold. Calculated. The same courtiers who once knelt before her now stood silent, guarded not by loyalty, but fear. And here's the sharpest cut. Anne wasn't trembling. She smiled, she joked. One eyewitness claimed she laughed with her ladies minutes before being called. But behind the composure, a mind splintered by exhaustion, spiritual desperation, and psychological siege. She hadn't slept. She had spent the night in prayer, kneeling before the sacrament at 2:00 a.m. By dawn, she was running on faith alone. What breaks a person faster? Steel or silence? When the executioner was summoned, Anne didn't flinch. She adjusted her gown, tucked her hair under the coif, and mounted the scaffold, not like a prisoner, but like a performer stepping into her final act. But this was no stage built for legacy. It was built to erase her. And still, her eyes didn't lower. The crowd held its breath. Anne knelt, upright, not against a block, a posture foreign to English tradition, a French custom requiring discipline, stillness, the sheer will not to move, even as death closed in. Her hands trembled, but her voice did not. She spoke her final words. Good Christian people, I am come hither to thee. Measured, formal, without accusation. She spoke of the king as a gentle and sovereign lord. But her silence on her guilt, that was her resistance. Then she was blindfolded. Not out of mercy, but necessity. If she flinched, the strike could fail. The sword needed clean access. She whispered prayers under her breath, her lips moving even as her vision disappeared into darkness. And behind her, the swordsman raised his weapon, quietly, swiftly, so she wouldn't hear it coming. Then, steel met flesh, a single strike, one brutal second. The sound, so quick, some say the crowd didn't realize what had happened until the head hit the straw. But the horror hadn't ended. It had just begun. Witnesses would later testify. Her eyes still blinked, her mouth still moved. Some claim she continued her prayer, silent words forming on severed lips. Others fainted, some turned away. Even the guards, hardened and trained for this moment, were visibly shaken. How do you explain a head that prays after death? Today, science offers answers: residual oxygen in the brain, involuntary muscle response. But in 1536, it was seen as something darker, a soul-resisting separation, a sign from God, or a warning. And the indignity didn't end there. No coffin had been prepared. Her ladies-in-waiting scrambled, grief-stricken, forced to place her remains in a simple arrow chest, originally meant for holding weapons. A queen reduced to cargo. No ceremony, no silence, no reverence. She was buried hastily beneath the chapel floor, nameless, unmarked. As if even in death, Henry demanded she be forgotten. But what he didn't know was that the real ghost of Anne Boleyn wasn't in the tower, it was in the ripple. The sword had fallen, the queen was dead. But the punishment didn't stop with Anne. It reached further, deeper, into the cradle of the Tudor court, into the life of a child barely old enough to speak her mother's name. Elizabeth Tudor, just 2 years old, woke the morning after her mother's execution to a new reality. No royal title, no household, no mother. Her status, illegitimate. Her existence, an inconvenience. The child of a queen was erased alongside her. Her belongings were stripped, her attendants dismissed. She was relocated with almost no notice, her clothing unfit for her former status. And no one dared speak Anne's name in the child's presence again. To erase Anne fully, Henry had to wipe her from the bloodline. And Elizabeth, once the heir to England, became just another royal mistake to be corrected. How do you destroy a legacy only to watch it rise again? Because the girl they cast aside would one day wear the crown. She would outlive them all. But in that moment, in 1536, she was just a political orphan, a shadow of her mother's ambition. The court moved on quickly. Anne's apartments were cleared, Jane Seymour's were furnished, even Anne's memory was wiped from the walls. Her emblems scraped off palace stone, her portraits destroyed or buried deep. No one mourned publicly, no poems, no monuments, only silence and fear. But the psychological fallout didn't end with Anne's daughter. Her ladies-in-waiting forced to clean her body, place her head in the makeshift chest, and witness the unspeakable. Some entered convents. Others disappeared from court life altogether. Many never spoke of what they had seen. Anne's death didn't just punish one woman. It terrorized an entire generation of women who had once thought ambition might protect them. Because now they knew, power didn't shield you. It painted a target on your back. And what came next proved it. Anne Boleyn's story was never meant to be remembered. Not like this. She was supposed to vanish. Quietly, completely. A cautionary tale buried beneath the chapel floor. A name too dangerous to whisper. A woman too ambitious to be mourned. But 5 centuries later, she still haunts us. Not because she lost her head, but because she never truly lost her power. Henry VIII destroyed her body, dismantled her court, and disinherited her child. He erased her from portraits, chiseled her emblems from the walls, and ordered silence in her wake. But history isn't so obedient, because Anne's bloodline endured. The daughter he declared illegitimate, she became Elizabeth I, the most iconic monarch in English history. And the irony? The king who killed for a male heir was succeeded by the very daughter he tried to erase. Anne Boleyn's death wasn't just a political execution. It was a case study in state-sanctioned destruction, of reputation, of memory, of womanhood. She was publicly humiliated, psychologically dismantled, executed with a foreign blade. And yet, her voice echoes through the cracks in stone, through Elizabeth's reign, through the pages they tried to burn. Did Anne Boleyn die for her sins or for her power? Was she guilty or just inconvenient? Have we misunderstood her all along? That's where you come in. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe Anne was a manipulator who flew too close to the sun? Or a victim of a king who couldn't stomach a woman who wouldn't kneel? And while you're here, hit subscribe for more stories of power, scandal, and the women history tried to silence. Share this video if it made you rethink what execution really means. And tell us, who should we uncover next? Because sometimes the loudest ghosts belong to those they tried hardest to forget.